So I've already been using some of these terms, but just in case you haven't seen them before. A variable is something we don't know how much it is yet. We use a letter to represent it, usually, sometimes Greek letters and Hebrew letters, but usually just regular old letters from our alphabet, X, Y, A, and B. A constant is just a value, so it's 3 or -2. And then we also have coefficients, and a coefficient is a multiplier that you see on a variable. So in this variable term here, 2a, we have the variable a and the coefficient 2, and altogether that makes a variable term. Some more vocab. We will see inverses a lot as we go on in math, and the simplest version of an inverse is the additive inverse of something. It's just a fancy way to say the opposite. It's the thing that's going to get you added up to 0. So an additive inverse is whatever is going to make 0 when you add them together. So 4 and -4 are additive inverses of each other. They add up to 0 at the end. -10 and 10 are additive inverses of each other. And it's just the opposite. You just change the sign. That's all it is. As we keep going, though, we'll see even more complicated inverses. Looking at negative numbers a little deeper. When you're adding a negative number to a positive number, each negative is going to cancel out one positive. So if you had, for example, 3 plus -2, which, side note, that's just 3 minus 2, right? You hopefully already know how to do that one, but let's look at it in a picture. We have 1, 2, 3 whole numbers, positive numbers, and we're taking away 2 negatives. So each of these negatives is going to cancel a positive. That's 1 and a -1. 1 minus 1 is 0. Same thing here. These guys cancel out, and we get left with 1. When you have it, let's do another example actually before we go farther. Let's say we have 3 plus -5. Same thing's going to happen. I have 3 little positives, and then I have 5 little negatives. And each of these negatives cancels one positive. And now what I'm left over with at the end is -2. This guy was +1, and here we've got -2. Think about that same problem if it was all positives, right? 3 plus 2. You know that that's 5. But just to show you a picture of what we're talking about here. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Nothing cancels. It just adds all together, and we have 5 at the end, right? So adding a negative with a negative. -3 plus -2. Nothing is going to cancel out, right? Because just like that all positive one, we have all negatives this time. So -3 and -2 together, nothing cancels. They all just come together, and we have -5. Every single time you add a negative and a negative, you are going to get a negative answer for adding. So, subtracting negative numbers. Subtracting 2, we said, was the same as adding -2. Because in either case, we're canceling out 2 of those positives, right? So very similarly, if you are subtracting -2, that is the same as adding the additive inverse of -2, which is just 2. If you owed me $10, right? You don't have your paycheck yet, and you're like, I'm going to pay you once I get my paycheck. And then I say, you know what? Forget it. I'm going to cancel your debt. You don't have to pay me those $10. It'll just be a gift instead. Now, when you get your paycheck, it's $10 bigger than it was going to be, right? Because you were going to get that paycheck and then have to immediately give me 10 of those dollars. But now that I've canceled that out, you have more money than you started with, right? So subtracting a negative is always going to end at a bigger number than what you started with. It's the same as adding. If we look on the number line at a couple addition problems, and I really recommend drawing a number line like in your notebook or somewhere where you just can always have it to reference, because sometimes adding and subtracting negatives gets us just like twisted. So let's think about the problem 2 plus 3. You know it already, right? But what 2 plus 3 means is we start at 2 and we add 3 onto it. So we're going to the right, we're adding a positive onto it. So we're going 1, 2, 3. It ends at 5. That's 2 plus 3. If we had 1 minus 2, that means we're starting at 1 and we're going backwards 2 till we get to -1. We're taking away 2 values, right? When we're adding 2 negatives together, -3 plus -1, that means we're starting at -3 and we're going backwards 1 because we're adding that negative to it. We're taking it away. We're going back here to -4. But let's say you were subtracting a negative instead. So say our problem was -2 minus -4. Normally to do -4, we would go left, going hop, 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 hop. But since we are subtracting -4, we have to do the opposite. We're doing the additive inverse, and we're going to go 2 plus 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, and end at 2. So subtracting a negative is exactly the same as adding a positive. I also had a teacher who would always write it like this. If you had 3 minus -2, you can just imagine that minus and that parentheses just turning into an enormous weird plus sign. So subtracting a negative is the same as adding a positive. All right. Again, this might be just a reminder, or maybe it's been a while since you've done this, but when you multiply a positive and a negative together, you're always going to get a negative answer. We didn't write it in here, but a positive number times a positive number will also always give you a positive number. But when you have 2 negatives multiplied together, the answer is always positive. And the reason for that is those 2 negatives cancel to a positive, right? So -2 times -5 is going to be positive 10. Even though 2 times -5 is -10. So when you have an even number of negatives, they cancel to be a positive answer. But if you have an odd, you have one left over of those negatives, then your answer is going to end up -2.